We begin, as we always do, with the truth of it. Adelaide Ferris was 46 years old, widowed twice over if you counted the marriage and the family that came with it. And by the autumn of 1889, she owned nothing in this world but a carpet bag, a black wool shawl gone thin at the elbows, and $11.40 wrapped in a handkerchief. It was her brother-in-law, Silas Ferris, who put her out of the freight house that had been her home for 11 years, standing in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his vest, and telling her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that a widow with no deed and no children had no claim on Ferris property, whatever her husband might have promised her in the dark of their marriage bed. She walked out of Canyon Hollow, Arizona territory, with the dust of the yard still on her boots, and 3 days later, at a county salvage auction held at the mouth of Larkspur Canyon, she raised her hand for the one thing no other soul in that crowd wanted: a rotted, sun-bleached freight wagon that had sat wedged in a canyon wash for 20 years, cursed in the mouths of children and shunned by grown men. And she paid $2 for the right to haul it out. They laughed at her. They called it foolishness, called it the last sad gesture of a woman with nowhere left to go. They did not know, and neither did she, not yet, that bolted beneath that wagon's rotted floorboards was a secret that had been waiting 2 decades to be found, one that would not only remake her fortune, but would call an entire vanished town back from its grave. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Ferris. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Adelaide Marsh had been raised on the banks of the Verde River by a father who mended wagon wheels and a mother who kept the ledgers for half the ranchers in the valley. And from the two of them, she had learned, without ever being told outright, that a thing's worth was rarely written plainly on its face. Her father used to run his palm along a cracked axle and say that would remembered its bending, that you could read a wagon's whole life in the grain of it if you were patient enough to look. And her mother, bent over columns of numbers by lamplight, taught her that figures did not lie even when the men who wrote them tried to make them do so. Adelaide grew up quick with sums and quicker with her hands, able to splice a rope, patch a harness, and balance a household's accounts to the penny, skills that in another life might have made her a shopkeeper or a schoolmistress, but which in the Arizona territory of the 1860s and 70s made her, mostly, a useful and largely invisible woman. She married Thomas Ferris when she was 22, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken teamster who drove freight for his father's company, and who loved her, she always said, the way a man loves rain after a long dry spell, with gratitude rather than hunger, which she had come, over the years, to understand was the better kind of love, even if it was the quieter kind. Thomas's father, Warren Ferris, had built the family's freight business up from 2 mules and a borrowed cart into the largest hauling concern between Prescott and the mining camps of the high desert, and by the time Adelaide married into the family, the Ferris name meant something in Canyon Hollow, meant good credit, meant a fine house on the ridge above the freight yard, meant Warren Ferris nodding to you first at church instead of the other way around. She never asked too many questions about how quickly that fortune had come together, because a young wife in those years learned early which doors in a house were meant to stay closed, and because Thomas himself seemed uneasy any time his father's early years were raised, changing the subject with the practiced ease of a man who had done it many times before. What she did know, what everyone in Canyon Hollow of a certain age knew and spoke of only in lowered voices, was that there had once been a second freight line in town, the Copperline Freight and Mining Company, which had vanished from local memory almost as completely as if it had never existed at all, its name scrubbed from ledgers, and its story reduced to a single grim fact repeated at gatherings when the whiskey ran low. That 20 years before, in the autumn of 1869, a wagon carrying the entire season's payroll for the Larkspur silver mine had gone into the canyon and never come out. And with it had gone the wages of nearly 40 men. And with those wages had gone the mine itself. And with the mine had gone the town's only real reason for existing. Half of Canyon Hollow's founding families had scattered within 2 years of that loss, chasing work in Prescott or Tucson or further still, and the ones who stayed did so with the particular bitterness of people who had watched their community die of a wound nobody could quite explain. It was, Adelaide had always been told, an Apache raiding party that took the payroll wagon, Though even as a young bride, she had noticed that the old-timers told this story with a strange hesitation, their eyes sliding sideways before they finished it, as though the words did not sit comfortably in their mouths. She learned, too, that it was in the 2 years following that disaster that Warren Ferris had quietly bought up nearly a third of the abandoned properties in town. The old assay office, 2 boarding houses, the feed store, half the lots along Canyon Street. Purchasing them for pennies from families desperate to leave, and had built from those ashes the freight empire that would one day put a roof over Adelaide's head, and just as surely, one day, take it away again. She loved Thomas Ferris honestly and fully for the 16 years of their marriage, and she told herself, as wives sometimes must, that whatever shadow lay behind his father's fortune was not a debt that belonged to her husband, nor to her. She kept her own small store of self-respect the way her mother had kept her ledgers, carefully, precisely, and in a place no one else could get at it. And she never stopped believing, even in the leanest years, that a thing's true worth was rarely visible at first glance, a belief that would matter more than she could have imagined, though not for a long while yet. Thomas Ferris died in the spring of 1888, thrown from a wagon seat on the Prescott Road, when a wheel struck a hidden rut, and Adelaide's world, which had always rested more heavily on him than she had let herself admit, came down around her all at once. There had been no formal deed drawn naming her as an owner of any part of the freight company, because in the Ferris family, as in most families of that country and that era, property passed through the men, and Thomas, trusting and unhurried as he was in all things, had simply never gotten around to putting anything in writing, believing there would always be more time. Silas Ferris, Thomas's older brother by 6 years, had never much cared for his sister-in-law, though he had been civil enough while Thomas lived to keep the peace, and Adelaide had always sensed beneath his politeness a kind of watchfulness, the look of a man totaling up a column of figures that did not include her in the sum. Silas had taken over management of the company entirely after their father Warren's death some years before, and he ran it with a coldness his father, whatever his sins, had never quite shown in public. Warren Ferris had at least remembered the names of his teamsters' wives and children, while Silas remembered only the freight rates. For a year and a half after Thomas's death, Adelaide kept the household books for the company, cooked for the hands, mended harness leather with her own hands the way her father had taught her, and told herself she was earning her keep, that Silas understood this arrangement as she did, an unspoken debt of family. She was wrong. In the autumn of 1889, Silas called her into the office that had once been his father's and told her, with the flat courtesy of a man reading aloud from a contract, that the company could no longer support a household member who contributed no legal ownership, that he intended to remarry come spring and his new wife would want the run of the house, and that Adelaide would need to make other arrangements by the end of the month. He offered her $11, which he called a generous parting gift, and did not offer to help her find a place to go. She did not weep in front of him, though she thought of little else on the long walk down from the Ridge House that afternoon, the wind carrying grit against her face, her carpet bag heavier with every step though it held almost nothing at all. She spent 2 nights in the back room of the Canyon Hollow boarding house, paying with coins she could not spare, turning over in her mind the plain and frightening arithmetic of a woman past 45 with no property, no family of her own left living, and a skill set, bookkeeping, mending, driving a team, that the town seemed to feel it had no further use for. It was on the 3rd morning, restless and unable to sleep past dawn, that she wandered down toward the courthouse steps where a small crowd had gathered for the county's autumn salvage auction, an event she had attended before out of idle curiosity, but never with any real intention of bidding, and it was there that her life, without any warning at all, began to turn. The auction that morning was a thin and unglamorous affair, mostly farm equipment seized for unpaid taxes and a few pieces of broken furniture from estate sale gone wrong, and Adelaide stood at the back of the crowd with her shawl pulled tight, not truly listening, until the auctioneer, a stout man named Purdy with a voice gone hoarse from years of shouting numbers in a dry air, cleared his throat and announced, almost as an afterthought, that the county was also willing to sell off its claim to a piece of derelict property lodged in Larkspur Canyon, an old freight wagon that had sat there, by his own admission, since before most of the men present had grown their first beard. A ripple of low laughter moved through the crowd. Someone near the front called out that the wagon was cursed, that it belonged to dead men and dead money. And old Purdy, clearly eager to be rid of an item that had apparently embarrassed the county rolls for 2 decades, said he would take $2 for the salvage rights and be glad to see the back of it. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted a rotted wagon shell that would cost more in mule labor to haul out of that canyon than it could ever be resold for as scrap lumber. And Purdy was already opening his mouth to withdraw the lot when Adelaide heard her own voice, thin but steady, call out that she would take it. The crowd turned to look at her, and she felt every eye on her shawl, her carpet bag still sitting by her feet where she'd set it down, and she understood exactly what they were thinking, that the widow Ferris, thrown out by her own kin, had gone a little simple with grief. She did not care. She had $2.40 of her 11 left to spare, and something in her, some old habit passed down from her father's hands on a cracked axle, told her that a thing left alone that long, that thoroughly forgotten, was worth at least the trouble of looking closely at before the world finished writing it off entirely. She paid her $2 to a bemused Purdy, arranged, with the last of her dignity and a favor called in from a boarding house stable hand named Eli Cobb, who owed her from a debt of her husband's kindness years before, to borrow a team and a chain, and set off the following morning up the dry wash road toward Larkspur Canyon, ignoring the stares of the town behind her. The wagon, when she reached it, looked at first like little more than a bleached skeleton half buried in sand and scrub brush, its canvas long since rotted to threads, its iron rims rusted nearly through, one wheel entirely gone and swallowed by 20 years of flash floods and drifting silt. It took her and Eli the better part of a day to work it free, digging by hand around the buried axle, coaxing the borrowed mules into a slow and grinding pull that finally, with a groan like something waking from a long sleep, dragged the wagon bed loose from the canyon floor. It was in that first night, camped beside the wash with the wagon looming beside her like some patient old animal finally brought to heel, that Adelaide, unable to sleep, took a lantern and began to examine it properly, running her palm along the wood exactly as her father had taught her, feeling for the grain, for the bending, for whatever story the wood itself might still be willing to tell. It was her hands, not her eyes, that found it first. A seam along the underside of the wagon bed that did not sit quite right, a board that gave slightly under pressure where the others held firm, joined with a craftsmanship far finer than the rest of the rough-hewn vehicle. She worked at it for the better part of an hour with a pry bar borrowed from Eli's kit, her heart beating harder than the labor alone could account for, until at last the board came loose and revealed beneath it a shallow, false compartment built into the wagon's very frame, dry and undisturbed, sealed so carefully against the desert damp that whatever lay inside had survived 20 years untouched. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, she found a leather ledger book, its pages foxed but legible, and beneath that a small iron strongbox no larger than a bread loaf, and tucked between the two, folded into a tight square, a letter addressed, in a careful, aging hand, to whoever might one day find it. She did not open the strongbox that night, some instinct telling her that the ledger and the letter deserved to be read first, that the order of things mattered. By lantern light, with Eli asleep by the fire a few yards off, she unfolded the letter and began to read, and what she read changed, in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, everything she believed about the family she had married into. The letter was signed by a man named Jonas Pruitt, who identified himself as the driver of the Copperline payroll wagon on the night of its disappearance in 1869, and his account, written in the plain, halting language of a man more comfortable with reins than with a pen, told a story entirely different from the one Canyon Hollow had told itself for 20 years. There had been no Apache raid. Pruitt wrote that he had been approached weeks before the payroll run by Warren Ferris himself, then a struggling rival freighter watching his own company sink beneath its debts, and offer a share of the payroll if he would help stage its disappearance, drive the wagon into the canyon under cover of dusk, meet Ferris and 2 hired men there, transfer the strongbox and most of its contents to a second, hidden wagon, and abandon the empty one to be found, its harness cut and its canvas torn too. Suggest an ambush. Pruitt had agreed, driven by his own debts, and had lived to regret it every day since. Watching the town he loved crumble in the wake of a theft he had helped commit, watching families he had grown up beside pack their wagons and leave for good, watching Warren Ferris rise from a failing freighter to the richest man in the valley on the strength of properties bought for nothing from the very families his crime had ruined. Pruitt wrote that his conscience had finally gotten the better of his fear, that he intended to make a full confession to the territorial marshal, but that Warren Ferris, perhaps sensing the change in him, had him quietly run off the payroll of every freight company in 3 counties before he could act, and Pruitt, old and broke and dying of a lung ailment by the time he finally wrote this letter, had done the only thing left within his power. He had recovered a portion of the original strongbox's contents, kept hidden by Ferris in a barn Pruitt still had access to, and returned it, along with his confession and a partial accounting of every man who had been owed wages that season, to the one place he was certain Warren Ferris himself would never think to look, the abandoned wagon rotting in Larkspur Canyon, sealed beneath a false floor Pruitt had built with his own hands as a young carpenter's apprentice, decades before he'd ever driven freight at all. The ledger, when Adelaide turned to it with trembling fingers, bore out every word. 41 names, each with a wage figure beside it, each some still owed, some crossed through with a note of a family's departure and a question mark where a forwarding address should have been. And the strongbox, when at last she worked its rusted latch open with a pry bar, held not a fortune exactly, but something close enough. Nearly $600 in coin, a sum that in 1889 Arizona Territory could restart a dozen ruined lives, along with a hand-drawn map, faded but readable, marking the location of the Larkspur Silver seam the original mine company had been working when the payroll theft killed its funding, a seam that, so far as Adelaide could tell from Pruitt's careful notations, had never actually run dry at all. She sat with all of it spread before her in the lantern light for a long while, the desert cold settling in around her shoulders, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not even vindication exactly, but a kind of grief for a whole town's worth of families she had never met, people whose names now sat in her lap in her dead husband's father's ruin. She thought of Silas, sleeping soundly that night in the ridge house that had been bought, she now understood, with a portion of this very theft. She thought of Thomas, who had never known, she was almost certain, the true shape of what his father had done, and who had died believing himself an honest man's honest son. And she understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality her mother had taught her over a lamp-lit ledger book decades before, that the $600 and the silver claim in her lap were not, in any moral sense, hers alone to keep. They belonged to 41 families and their descendants, scattered across 3 territories by a crime that had never been answered for. What she did have, she realized, was something perhaps more valuable than the money itself: proof. She returned to Canyon Hollow 3 days later with a wagon in tow, the ledger and letter hidden carefully in her carpet bag, and said nothing to anyone of what she had found, not yet, moving instead with the same quiet deliberateness her mother had shown, balancing a difficult column of figures, checking, rechecking, making certain of her ground before she committed to a single number. She spent a week at the boarding house, using a portion of the recovered coins sparingly and without explanation, tracking down, through old church registries and post office records, whatever she could learn of the families named in Pruitt's ledger, several of whom, she discovered with quiet satisfaction, had never left the territory at all, but had simply resettled in Prescott, close enough to reach within a few days' ride. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Canyon Hollow, that word would travel of the widow Ferris hauling a wagon out of Larkspur Canyon, and it was Silas himself who came to find her at the boarding house on a windy evening in late October, his face carrying an expression she had never before seen on it. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, a wariness she recognized from the letter in her bag, as though some family instinct had been passed down alongside the money itself. He had heard, he said, that she'd been asking questions in Prescott about old Coppeline families, and he wanted to know why. Adelaide, who had spent the intervening days deciding exactly how this conversation would go, told him plainly and without embellishment what she had found beneath the wagon's floor. Watching his face carefully as she spoke, and saw the color drain slowly from it as she described Pruitt's letter word for word, though she was careful, even then, not to show him the letter itself. Silas's first instinct, as she had known it would be, was denial, then anger, and finally, when neither of those worked on a woman who had already decided her course, an offer. He would pay her, handsomely, for the ledger and the letter and her silence, more money than the strongbox itself had held, if she would simply hand the whole matter over and let the past stay buried where it had lain for 20 years. It would have been easy, in that moment, to feel the old temptation of security rising in her, the promise of a comfortable, quiet future bought with someone else's forgotten shame. And she would not pretend to us now, telling this story, that the offer held no pull on a woman who had so recently owned nothing but a carpet bag and $11. But she thought of the 41 names in Pruitt's careful hand, a family she had never met who had spent 20 years believing their fathers and husbands had simply vanished into an Apache raid, denied even the small dignity of knowing the truth, and she told Silas Ferris, in a voice steadier than she felt, that the ledger was not hers to sell, and neither, any longer, was his family's silence. Silas did not take the refusal well. Within days, rumors began circulating through Canyon Hollow that the widow Ferris had gone unstable with grief, was making wild accusations against a respected local family, was perhaps even attempting some manner of extortion herself, and Adelaide found doors that had once been open to her: the general store, the church social committee, even the boarding house proprietress who had known her for years, growing suddenly cold and cautious. Silas was, after all, the wealthiest man remaining in a town that had few enough of them left, and few people in Canyon Hollow were eager to stake their own small livelihoods against his displeasure over the word of a penniless widow with a story about a rotted wagon. It would have been easy, too, to give up in the face of that quiet, communal turning away, the particular loneliness of being disbelieved by people who had once at least been polite to her. But Adelaide had not spent a lifetime keeping careful ledgers and reading the grain of old wood only to be undone by gossip. And so instead of retreating, she did the one thing Silas had clearly not anticipated. She went to Prescott herself, ledger and letter in hand, and sought out not the marshal first, who she suspected might be too tangled in local politics to act quickly, but the editor of the Prescott Territorial newspaper, a sharp-eyed woman named Harriet Voss who had built her papers. Reputation on exactly the kind of long-buried scandal Adelaide now laid before her. Voss read Pruitt's letter twice through without speaking, then asked Adelaide, quietly, whether she understood what publishing such a story would cost her, whether she was prepared for Silas Ferris, and whatever allies his money could still buy to fight this with everything they had. Adelaide told her, simply, that she had already lost everything a person could reasonably be asked to lose, and that the only thing left worth protecting was the truth she now carried in her bag. The story ran in the Prescott paper 11 days later, under Harriet Voss's own byline, laying out Jonas Pruitt's confession in full alongside a facsimile of the original payroll ledger. And it did not take long, once it was printed in ink that the whole territory could read, for the truth to travel faster and further than Silas Ferris's reputation could withstand. Several of the families named in Pruitt's accounting, resettled in Prescott and reading their own fathers and grandfathers' names in the newspaper for the first time in 20 years, came forward publicly, and what had once been dismissed as one grieving widow's wild talk became, almost overnight, an accounting the territorial authorities could no longer ignore. Silas Ferris did not go to prison. The crime, after all, had been his father's, committed and largely completed before Silas himself came of age, and there was no clean legal path to punish a son for a father's theft, whatever moral debt remained. But the freight company's contracts, several of them held with mining concerns and county offices that read Harriet Voss's paper with great interest, began quietly evaporating, and the Ridge House, and the freight yard, and most of what Silas Ferris had built his standing upon, all of it resting, in the end, on foundations Adelaide's discovery had proven rotten clear through, could not survive the weight of a town's collective memory finally restored to it. Silas sold the freight company within the year to a Prescott concern and left Canyon Hollow quietly, without ceremony, in a manner that felt, to those who had watched him cast his own brother's widow out into the cold, not so many months before, like a kind of justice too fitting to be entirely coincidence, though no one, least of all Adelaide, ever claimed to have engineered it that way. What Adelaide did with the recovered $600, once the legal dust had settled and the territorial court had recognized her, as the discoverer and rightful custodian of Pruitt's confession, as the party withstanding to see the matter through, surprised nearly everyone who had laughed at her $2 purchase that autumn morning. She did not keep it. She divided it, according to Pruitt's own careful ledger, among the surviving families and descendants of the 41 men who had been owed those wages 20 years before, traveling herself, by wagon and by rail, to place the money in hands that had waited 2 decades without knowing there was anything left to wait for. And a silver claim marked on Pruitt's faded map, which surveyors confirmed the following spring had indeed never played out, she did not sell to the highest bidder either, but organized instead into a cooperative venture among those same families, a new mining concern owned collectively by the people the old theft had ruined, breathing life back into a claim, and slowly, unmistakably, back into a town that had spent 20 years believing itself simply cursed rather than robbed. Canyon Hollow did not become a boomtown overnight, and Adelaide never pretended it would, but within 2 years the population had grown by a third, the old Assay office reopened under new management, and the wagon itself, restored and repainted, was set on permanent display outside the new cooperative mining office, a plaque beneath it telling, in plain, unadorned language, the true story of what had happened in Larkspur Canyon in 1869, so that no family's suffering there would ever again be reduced to rumor and a shrug. We began this story by telling you that a 46-year-old widow named Adelaide Ferris was cast out with nothing but a carpet bag and $11, and that she spent 2 of those dollars on a wagon the whole town called cursed and foolish. We told you she was foolish too, or seemed so, standing at that auction with her shawl pulled tight while men who had known her for years laughed behind their hands. But we told you also from the very start that something sealed inside that wagon would change her life and restore community, and now you know the shape of it. Not treasure exactly, though there was coin enough involved, but the far rarer thing of a truth finally allowed to surface after 20 years buried beneath false floors and false stories both. Adelaide never grew wealthy in the way Silas Ferris once had been, never built herself a house on any ridge, and seemed, by every account left of her, entirely uninterested in doing so. She kept the books for the new mining cooperative for many years afterward, her father's old lesson about reading the grain of things and her mother's lesson about honest figures both finally put to their fullest use, and she was remembered in Canyon Hollow, long after her passing, not as a woman who found a fortune, but as the woman who looked closely enough at a thing everyone else had already decided was worthless and found, underneath it, exactly what a whole community had been waiting 20 years to hear. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Adelaide Ferris tonight. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share with someone who might need to hear it. And we would love to know, down in the comments, about a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off as worthless. We read every one of them, and we're always glad to sit with you a while longer. Until next time, stay close.